going back to what I do, I deal mostly with apples, and truly I have a vision, hopefully, for Southeast Alaska to become more food secure, and that is to have fruit available for all of Southeast Alaska. And for us, we're taking our experience to the next level, and we want to grow fruit for Southeast. We've got 5.5 acres right now that we're currently working with, and have been experimenting with fruit trees within high tunnels, as well as different variations outside. I'm going to throw out a few facts for people just to kind of get people oriented as between the commercial industry and just the homeowner kind of industry that, well, not industry, but the homeowner version of an orchard. But a few facts are truly modern orchards can grow up to 40 to 60,000 pounds per acre. And we'll show a few pictures of those. And something to note, that another reason to grow your own fruit is to know that after knowing that the supermarket apples are stored up to 14 months. And so you just don't get the nutritional levels that you would at a fresh fruit. So I'm just going to kind of rehash a few things that have been talked about in previous presentations. One of them being the common rootstocks for Alaska. And I'm doing this just so we all kind of orient ourselves again, because we're talking about high tunnels and we're talking about stuff outside. And it's important to know that we need to consider what type of rootstocks that we use for a high tunnel variation. And so just for terminology, you can see here, if we talk about a signwood, you're talking about the upper grafted part. The variety such as Honeycrisp would be the signwood. The bottom layer is the rootstock, and there's many versions of different rootstocks. And the importance of this is to know that a Honeycrisp apple is directly from a certain genetic pool of seedling. And so if you got a Honeycrisp, you can't just take a seed and plant it and expect a Honeycrisp. You're going to get a different variation. So that's why, one of the reasons why when we have something good, we want to keep it good. So we have signwood that we graft onto rootstocks, and rootstocks give us the ability to dwarf the trees, as well as they give us a hardiness factor. Some areas like up north, meaning even Fairbanks, they only got a couple types of rootstocks they can use. Baccata, they use doggo type rootstocks, and those are the only kinds, well, a few other kinds that they use that can meet and overcome a -40 situation. So basic things, signwood is a variety we want to replicate. The rootstocks determine the size of the tree and increases the tree's hardiness. So a few of the common rootstocks for Southeast, ones that I utilize a lot are Buttigovsky 118. These are semi-dwarf, cold and wet hardy clonal rootstocks. Clonal meaning that it's not just a seedling. We literally root sticks or take roots and move them over, and we sucker them and we get other rootstocks off of them. And M7 is a popular one. I know we've gone through many of these, and Antonovka is a full-size tree. B9 is one that I'm just going to highlight here because it's a commercial variation that they utilize in row plantings a lot, and something that you'd want to consider for a high tunnel type of planting, because it is a very productive, yet it's hardy and it's disease resistant, but it's dwarfing. It's a dwarfing rootstock. And Oregon crabapple is one that a lot of people have around their own neighborhood. It's very hard wood, and not a lot of varieties graft onto it, but it's something that you can get out in the forest area. And in fact, they grow in muskegs. So just a couple of these photos here. Williams Pride is one that we're going to talk a lot about. Williams Pride is grafted on a wild crabapple. So they are compatible, just so you know. And just an interesting photo. I've shown this in the past with Blythe. You could see a Buttigovsky 118 rootstock with a graft union here. And on the top is the signwood of whatever variety that is. So it's just interesting how the wood has color in it. It's its own natural stain, but at the actual graft union, that staining is no longer there. So Alaska fruiting limitations. I'm putting this out because I'm kind of setting the foundation of why we actually are considering high tunnels for micro orchard systems. And truly, Alaska is often limited to early and mid-season ripening varieties. Up to, and we've talked about this in the past, just a common one is Honeycrisp. You can, on a very good location, you could ripen a Honeycrisp outside. Haines would be pretty good at this. The other thing we're looking for for Alaska's disease resistance varieties, which are most resilient to Southeast Alaska's temperate rainforest. And we're talking mostly about apple scab, and we'll show some photos of that just to re-show what apple scab is if you're not sure about it. Another random fact is there are more than 7,500 varieties of apples, over 1,200 varieties of cherries, and over 40 different species of plum. And the thing is for us in Alaska, we just need to determine the correct fruit varieties and rootstocks for air, or even create our own or consider this with our own seedlings. And high tunnels have less limitations as far as growing in Alaska, which is why it's so important, I think, for people to really kind of experiment and kind of see what's going on, the advantages here, and we'll talk about that. A couple of these photos are, common terms, again, is Williams Pride, and Pristine is another one that's very popular around here. These are disease resistant varieties. These are outdoor pictures, obviously, and they're beautiful apples. They're tasty, and if you're not familiar with them, they're pretty unique flavored. But I just want to make note of those to show you that, yes, it can work outside. So we're going to talk about high tunnels and high tunnels versus greenhouses. I think it's just important just to note that high tunnels are passive ventilation versus powered ventilation. That's usually the definition that most people kind of examine when they say a high tunnel versus greenhouse. There's lots of different definitions out there. And I'm just kind of showing here what we utilize. And this is a Gothic style greenhouse with the steel poles in here. And this is a pretty common one. This is the outside view. You can see the snow actually sheds off of it. And if you got a lot of snow, realistically, the snow needs to get pushed out of the way. It can cause some problems. On the left side, I'm just showing on here, this is a wooden truss that I made. And it just to show that people can make their own version of a high tunnel. And there are actually prints online that you can actually make wooden greenhouse styles. In the past, people have asked me, what are your sources for greenhouses? And one of the popular ones around Southeast is Oregon Valley greenhouses. I'm not trying to promote any one, but these are ones that people use a lot here. Farm Tech, Grow Span, or make your own. You can make your own version. And I know Rob Goldberg's going to talk about some of this. So a recommended high tunnel version design, really Gothic style. Gothic style is the terminology, kind of showing this type of truss that goes up, and we want something that sheds snow, especially up in Haines. Hoonah, we get a lot of snow as well. And so that's the type that we're utilizing. And we use a single layer of plastic. There's different variations that you can use. They make double layer plastic, which is an insulator, and they put air into it. One thing to note is if you get that system, you have to consider the fact that you need power all the time for that. For us, we rely solely on solar radiation to heat the space with passive ventilation. Okay, it's a high tunnel. And we have high sides recommended, and most of the greenhouse manufacturers only go up to a 6-foot version. And for fruit tree micro orchard systems, my recommendation is a high-sided one as much as you can deal with, because you're trying to get as much space on the sides to get the trees to grow. And for us, we also use ground cloth to control weeds. And we'll talk about a little bit more of this. So 3 reasons to grow in high tunnels. And let's just say, so if you can grow outside, why grow in high tunnels? Well, there's many different reasons. Fruit ripens perfectly and early in high tunnels. And of course, we all love to pick fruit early, and especially perfect fruit. So high tunnels allow us to manage organic growing with fewer pests and diseases. Everybody's looking for holistic options and do not want to spray, especially with chemicals. A lot of this is used, chemicals are used in the commercial industry, especially a lot on the East Coast. Number 2, high tunnels allow us to harvest fruits approximately 1 month earlier and 1 month later in the growing season. And 3, high tunnels maximize the yield of perfect, unusual, and late season fruit varieties for our area, which is very important because late season varieties, really, we're talking about even, some of the Cox's Pippin that are out there, some of the ones that are very unusual that you see inside the commercial industry. A a lot of those are late season ripening varieties. And fortunately, Honeycrisp can be done here, but we're going to show you the difference between a high tunnel honey and a outside Honeycrisp. So let's just talk about some of the pests and why high tunnels give you an advantage over these. But it's important just to note what these are. So scabby varieties like Norland or Goodland, they're no longer a problem. I know in Haines, it doesn't seem like a lot of people have as much of an apple scab problem. This is a picture of apple scab, and there's ways to get over that, meaning a lot of spraying. Phytophthora, it's kind of a slime mold in the ground for wet areas. You just don't have as much of that or any of it inside a greenhouse. High tunnels minimize bug and caterpillar damages. Here we go, the woolly caterpillar, and we'll get into that. They minimize rodent damages. We're able to control rodent girdling because the snows are just non-existent around the stems, and this is a major issue for a lot of people, is voles. And inside a greenhouse, it can be a problem, which is why we note this bucket trap here on the right side. And really, it's just a flush mounted bucket trap. It's just dug a hole in the ground, put a bucket in there. And once the voles kind of get in there, you don't even really need this, like this yogurt container with a line going through it that they hop on and you bait on with peanut butter. For whatever reason, they just jump in, and this is a good way to monitor rodents inside your greenhouse. For high tunnels, you also minimize bird speck or pecking on fruit, or even woodpeckers. So a lot of people have issues with woodpeckers. There's no sun scalding. Sun scalding is when the spring happens and you get the sun coming out like today, and then all of a sudden it freezes real hard at night. So the sap starts flowing, then it freezes, and then you get this crack on the south, we call it southwest injury. And so this is noted right here, which is why a lot of people use paint outside. And another thing is bears like fruit and tend to avoid entering the high tunnels. But electric fences, even so, at times when things are really going or fruiting, there's a pretty good smell, a fragrant smell in these structures, and you should consider an electric fence even so. And I'll just make a note here. Here's again outside. If people aren't aware of it, outside this is vole damage on the side of a rootstock there. And we put these 1/4-inch steel mesh around here, and that tends to take care of the problem in it. We'll go from there. This is a bonus slide. I think it's important just to throw in here because people are having a lot of issues with this. Again, high tunnels, we just don't have as much of this problem, and that is the tiger moth. And it's the spotted tussock moth, tiger moth, aka woolly buggers. Okay, this is the moth you're looking for. Here's the larvae. Here's another picture of the larvae on here. And when you look on this photo in the middle here, you'll see these leaves that are dead. This is what you're looking for. You want to get on this right away. If you see this on your trees, just grab the leaf and pull it off and squish those little guys off before they just start cultivating your plant there. You want to get them off when they're young. You can use tanglefoot around certain areas, around branches, so they can't go mobile. And here's a picture of that. If you get a woolly bugger or some kind of bug or aphid, you can put it around the base of a small tree and they get stuck in that. And thuricide, which is an organic substance, BT, which is commonly used. I just want to note on here this variation of a wasp here. I've seen these guys. They're one of our allies. Just consider, don't kill them. They tend to go after the caterpillars around here and they sting them. I've seen them go after whole colonies. So just want to know your allies and you want to know your enemies. So things to look for. Definitely do not want to be passive on these because they will eat whole trees. So high tunnels, number two, they add an existing 2+ months of growing season. So that gives us a longer growing season. That gives us new varieties that we would not normally be able to plant outside. So here on the right side, I've got a few photos here of a Williams Pride in a high tunnel. These are Williams Pride apples in a high tunnel. And you can see that's August 11th. Here on the right side of it is September 16th. That's an outside Williams Pride. They look a little bit different, but they both got different flavors, but you can ripen them both inside and outside. Honeycrisp, here you go. Honeycrisp, not quite the color that you want to see on a Honeycrisp. And so we got big fruit that don't quite get as sweet, but it's a good apple. It's a good sized apple and you can store it. So Honeycrisp, outside or in the high tunnel. This is a picture of one at the end of September. Outside, end of September. Apparently, we've got 2 end of Septembers here. One being for exact same time outside and the exact same time inside. So you see the color variations between the two. Varieties such as Honey Crisp, Ashmead's Kernel, Cox's Orange Pippin, these are all late season varieties. Those ones you can do perfect inside a high tunnel. Early season varieties such as Lubbock Queen or early Geneva, all of a sudden you get this ability to have early season fruit where you're picking in early July, and then you go back outside and you're picking Lubbock outside in late July. So the basic rule is if you can ripen it outside, you can ripen it at least 1 month earlier in the high tunnel. So high tunnels allow for full ripening on the tree and extended harvest. So you can really see there's the fruit, the juice that comes in one of these. This is a Williams. And you can see the coloration, that's anthocyanins, that's antioxidants realistically. And we get a lot of that in our fruit. And anyways, you can see outside, here we are picking different late season varieties. High tunnels make perfect fruits. Again, you can see plums. We got different varieties here. This is Imperial. There's minimal spots or blemishes. It's just perfectly ripe fruit. The cherries just don't seem to have any problems, no cracking. We just got more of a controlled environment. And so you can really get a lot of fruit on a little tree. So for us, it's just important to note, this is what we do. It doesn't mean it's the best option, but this is what we have for us because we share our high tunnel with people. And we are constantly moving stuff in and out. But we utilize growing our trees in pots, and these are what they call air pots. So our pots are fabric pots that help to prevent root girdling, yet help to dwarf the tree. And roots pots is one of them, but there's so many different new types out there. You can look on Amazon. Pots allow us to move them outside when they have fruited and make room for other items. So if it's fruited, you can take it outside and get another variety from outside and bring it in. If you don't have the room, and ripen it up. So it just kind of gives you that extended, it truly gives you the extended version of an orchard. And in model commercial orchards, apples are planted as close as 1 foot on a trellis system. And I'm making note of this. Here's again of that picture. We showed this before in a previous presentation. And realistically, this is what I would like to see eventually in our own hoop houses, is to have these rows. And this is a Budagovsky 9 root system on here, and they get pretty tall. And so, and we've got options as far as maintaining these trees in this type of micro orchard system. And we'll talk about that. So one thing that's very important is if you're going to do this, especially in a pot or even in rows, you got to maintain living soils. You can't just put it in a pot and expect to get good fruit. You got to keep those pots biologically active. And when I term that, I mean like you want things living in there. You want worms to thrive in there. And this is really, truly just talking about healthy soil, mycorrhiza, which means you want to mulch. And generally, we have a lot of leaves in the fall. We mulch with leaves, and then we suppress that with seaweed. And so you kind of get this variation of tree mulch and seaweed throughout the seasons. You want to keep the worms alive and thriving in those pots for sure. And then number 2, you need to make sure that if you're going to do this, you need to make sure to water very well at times. And, you know, ideally, having a irrigation system in a greenhouse would be the best situation. Sunny days really require good watering. You know, if it's really late in the season and it's kind of cool, generally you can get by a couple of days without having to water. And we talked about mycorrhiza fungi. It creates a symbiotic relationship with the tree's roots, which increases nutrient intake and root mass. And, you know, I'll just say one thing about these air pots. It's really important to note, if you do a little research on them, what happens is the root system hits them, and they just kind of put these feather roots out there. So it's not like this girdling mass of roots. They put these little feather roots out, and really, so you're getting a really big, healthy root system, maximizing the pot. And our trees don't seem to be stunted by them. Seasonal maintenance. We want to talk about spring care, and this is really important to really kind of get acquainted with what's going on in your micro orchard system within your hoop house there. They start waking up in March. Generally, if we're grafting trees in March as well. And having everything transplanted, organized, and clean is very important at this time of year. This time of year, you want to watch for aphids. You want to watch it bud break, especially. Too much nitrogen often creates a aphid infestation, so just something to consider. And when you do this, there's different recipes online. You can even utilize a little bit of dish soap, and neem oil works well as well. Sometimes you need to hand pollinate. I'm showing this on this photo here, but what's really neat, and I believe Rob is going to talk about this, but we end up with bumblebees just when they're not around anywhere else. Somehow they show up, and when it's cold and snowy outside, the bumblebees show up in the greenhouse. I don't know why, but it's just amazing. When the flowers, somehow they find them. You want to make sure the trees are mulched and the worms are happy. This is very important. We want to create nutrient activity, and the worms need to be, again, and I use the red wigglers in there if you have a question about that. Water your trees well in the spring, especially if they're coming out of the dormant season here. Make sure they're not dried out. All right, smell the blossoms. Enjoy it. Summer care. Fruit pruning is really important. You can kind of see here, it's real easy to, when you have perfect conditions, you get a lot of fruit, and all of a sudden we're having to thin out a bunch. So this is just it looks like a Honeycrisp tree. Lots of apples. We're looking for the king blossom fruit lit here, which is going to be the biggest one in the middle. And so usually by this time, when they get to this point, I'm picking them out. I'm picking out the ones that they're bug eaten, take them off. So we want to be able to get every 5 to 6 inches an apple on there. And it's important to note that thinning early makes bigger apples in the fall and prevents a tree from fruiting biannually, meaning that every other year. So sometimes the tree needs a rest. If you fruit it too heavy, it's going to want to rest. Again, we need to water. Don't let those trees go dry, especially on those sunny days. Good watering equals big fruit. Monitor your pests. Continue to observe insect pressure. Watch for excessive caterpillars, especially those tiger moth caterpillars. Encourage beneficial insects such as spiders. You want spiders in your greenhouse on the trees to balance bug pressure. So this is a good example when we didn't thin enough. The trees just fall apart. So tart apples equals pie. Midsummer through fall. You want to stake up those trees because it's about time to feast. Harvest early season varieties such as Lubisk, Early Geneva. These are, if you're not familiar with they're becoming more common here in Southeast Alaska. We're going to harvest cherries in June through July, and we're going to keep harvesting with this extended season through November for late ripening varieties like Honeycrisp. You're going to have to get creative. If you're just doing them in a pot, you're going to have to find a way to kind of trellis them up some way. And ideally, again, to have a trellis system in a greenhouse is the best situation because productive trees will destroy themselves. You're going to harvest cherries in June and July. Again, you can kind of see the production here, just perfect fruits. These are some varieties here, Kristen Sam, Montmorency, and Vandalay. These are ones that we use, and they're all good varieties. Imperial Plum and a hoop house here. They work great, and Methley. This is a few outside, and they work great. We're going to harvest Lubisk Queen in July. These are on the left side here, Lubisk Queen, and we get pretty good fruit outside with a Lubisk Queen. And inside, we're going to be harvesting earlier. Early Geneva, harvest in July again. Williams Pride again. This one is so, to me, this is what I'm kind of banking on. Again, I'm just showing these photos of how dark red these varieties and how productive they truly can be. This is a good recipe here, beech kelp. We use a lot of beech kelp around here. We get a lot of anthocyans, which are these red-fleshed apples from a lot of the beech kelps that come around here and some of the cooling temperatures. And these are truly antioxidants, and it's just something to really be aware of. And these apples are much sweeter often inside utilizing this recipe with the beech kelp and the warmer temperatures in the hoop house. We get perfect Honeycrisp. Some of these larger Honeycrisp trees aren't a 30-gallon pot. They produce 60 pounds per at times at their best in the season. And a lot of these apples are 1 pound apples. And in this photo, I just want to note, these are 8-year-old trees on Budagovsky 118. And I noted Budagovsky 118 is a semi-dwarf. These are not even bud 9s. It's just what I started out with. But it just goes to show that after so many years, truly a semi-dwarf tree with good pruning and as well as the utilization of an air pot system and training and fruiting the trees while they're young, you can truly maintain a old tree on a semi-dwarf and get good production. And you can keep it small enough within a hoop house. So we're not truly limited by a B9 root system or a dwarfing root system in a hoop house. In fact, the good thing about the semi-dwarfs is that they have a full root system and they don't tend to lean over. Usually they'll root in the pot to a point where the whole pot will just want to fall over. So you need to get creative. Truly, if you're going to do it, if you're going to plant in the ground, that's great. And I know Rob's done a lot of that, and we'll talk about it. Williams Pride, these are 9-year-old trees, and this is not even in a root, an air pot system. But again, these are on Budagovsky 118. These are a second picking, because with Williams, sometimes you get a few pickings. It's things ripen at different rates with the Williams. But you can see the production. Pristine apples, here's pristine in August. Just another good apple. I showed you this earlier. That one's a good one for inside and outside. I'm really just noting apples mostly right now. Winter banana is a good pollinator. I know this looks pretty rugged in here, but it's just, if you can just see this little tiny tree here, this is on an M27 in a pot, and it's pretty weedy, obviously. It needed to get weeded out a long time ago, but you know, we get overwhelmed at times. And you'll see that, look at the apples on this little tree, and this tree is producing annually, and this one's has already been picked about 3 different times. This is my Franken tree. There's each stem has a different variety. One would be like a Norland, so we get an apple really early in the season, and then we'll get maybe an Akani later on in the season. And actually, I even got pears that'll graft onto this winter banana tree. Winter banana is pretty unique to that. And then we got Gold Rush. That'll be the last picking. That'll be late season varieties. But you can just see the production we're getting on this. So I'm constantly picking on that tree stem is only like 2.5 inches on this little tiny pot, really. So anyways, it's really interesting, the production you can get in a high tunnel situation, being able to monitor a small tree. So the advantage really is we get to harvest a lot of apples, monster apples, winter banana apples, Spartan, Honeycrisp, Rome Beauty is a good one, Williams, Liveland Raspberry. And you can just see with these photos, they're just all perfect, beautiful apples. Harvest, harvest, harvest. Those are all Honeycrisp trees and a few other variations in the middle in one row. And then Cameron, don't forget the apples outside. Again, so once we're done inside, anything that's earlier season or the same variety that's outside, we pick those and then we go outside and pick. So it's nice to have an apple tree, obviously, within a high tunnel system and outside, the extended pickings. Just showing some photos of the productions, going out, having a good time. Very important, early winter, as things go dormant, we want to consolidate the trees and mulch. We want to water well. Again, once you water those things, and I flood those pots, you can just leave them for the winter. You don't need to spend, your winter months rewatering. They'll just freeze up. Those root systems, you're going to have a little faith. They're going to come back alive. You don't want to just leave these outside in the rain. You want to leave them in the hoop house. That can create issues. Very important. Some things you do need to consider is basic winter maintenance. You need to maintain a rodent trap and watch for voles. Again, this is so important. Here's that bucket trap in the ground again. This is very effective. Consider maintaining a worm composting bin like this recycled freezer. In other words, we have worms in there, we throw leaves in there, we throw whatever items that you can think of just to get that worm tea that we can utilize for other things. And then we can keep worms cultivated so we have them to put in pots if we need to. And you got to keep the snow from destroying your high tunnel. If you have a really heavy season, especially in Haines, you just need to really monitor your high tunnel system. Important. So this is just a few photos here of pruning and training to be able to maintain a tree that's small inside a hoop house situation. So you want to prune trees around early March, you can do it earlier, especially in a hoop house, prune to an upward branch to maintain a small tree. I'm showing this bottom right photo here. So this tree was fruiting up top here, but I want to maintain it small. So I cut right above this vertical branch here, and you can see what it looks like afterwards. Now, if I cut below that, what's going to happen is that without a vertical branch on top, all these little buds out here are going to just sucker straight out, and we're going to get a bunch of branches going all over the place, and you kind of lose your central leader. And so this is just a good way to keep things from really just suckering out and be able to maintain a smaller tree, is by maintaining a upward branch. And on the photo on the left, you know, I showed this because this is something I've been working with, is instead of just pruning everything off and trying to prune the bud to make it go where you want to, training actually takes the branch and you can bend it upward. This branch was horizontal. I turned it vertical. And when you have a vertical branch, it goes into vegetative mode. When you have a horizontal branch, it goes into fruiting mode. You can see the fruit spurs on here. So when your arms are down, that creates apples. When they're up, we want to grow to the sun. So anyways, it's just a good way to reconfigure a tree without making it just sucker all over the place. And to be able to get structure back, especially if you got a tree that was problematic and it fruited early and the thing fell over and you lost your good structure and you got to start over. So apples work for Alaska. I hope this helps people with a high tunnel situation and kind of see truly what the high production rate could be versus outside. They make a productive micro orchard system very quickly. Are you catching the vision as we started out in the beginning? So my hope, again, is to do this micro orchard system in high tunnels on a commercial scale. Please visit us at alaskaAppleFarms.com if you haven't seen that. And, you know, we do need to update some things, but it is online. There is a nice video on there showing other items of what we are doing here in Southeast. Okay, Burl, back to you.
I'll
stop share.
Just unmute myself. And then I have, let's see, Rob Goldberg has, let's go to Rob Goldberg presentation, share. Can you see that, Darren? Can you work with this shared screen?
That looks great to me. And I don't know if there were a couple questions from Rob Bishop's presentation.
Yes, please.
Can you see those there, Rob, or should I read them? Or
Yeah, I don't see them. Maybe I need to go to the chat here.
It's just Ed was asking about comparing the size of the trees between the Bud 118 and the M7.
Yeah, so honestly, the M7 and the Bud 118, I have not, they tend to grow very similar. And I would say that M7 actually, I believe it does better with certain varieties. Bud 118 is a very common rootstock, and I would call them very similar. M7 has a lot of, it seems to tolerate the weather fine here.
And then Andrea was wondering about protecting the roots of the potted trees from freezing.
Yeah, so I'll just give you an example. A friend of mine got a tree of mine, and he had a potted tree, and he left it outside, and it was in a root bag, and he left it out, not just under cover, he put it out, and I was bummed. I had to talk to the guy. He just bought it. Winter happened, and it sat in the snow. The bulls didn't get it. I thought for sure he's going to have issues, and it's probably not going to make it. He got really fortunate, and it did fine. But it's really important that I believe in the hoop house, especially, that if you got items that you can mulch around it, it's worth doing. But what I'm sharing with you is just a testimony of the root systems of a Budagovsky 118, especially some of the variations out there. I can't say all of them, but Budagovsky 118 is very hardy for our area. But I would mulch it, and if I got a lot of pots, I tend to just put them kind of compile next to each other, so they don't all just freeze heavy around it. But they do freeze. And you know, as long as they're not like frozen in a pile of ice, which is what you don't want to do, is leave that tree outside like that guy did. He got really fortunate. They are pretty hardy systems.
I'm Rob Goldberg. I live near Haines, and And I've been growing fruit here since about 1985. I planted my first trees outside and quickly discovered that growing fruit here in Southeast Alaska is not an easy thing to do. Everything that could go wrong did go wrong. I ended up replacing a lot of trees. I can just list the problems right off. I had heavy snow break my trees, especially when the trees were small. I had moose come in and eat the trees. Rain would make the cherries crack. When the trees did start to fruit, I had bears coming in and wrecking the trees, birds eating the fruit, squirrels eating the fruit, even wind breaking the branches off the trees. And so I did have some successful years, but I thought there's got to be a better way to do this. And it occurred to me that sheltering the trees in a greenhouse or high tunnel might be a way to solve all of those problems. Another problem is that we're so limited in varieties here that we can ripen outdoors, that I thought, okay, I'm going to get extra heat in the greenhouse. I'll be able to ripen some varieties that I can't ripen outside. It'll extend the season. I can keep moose and bears and birds away from the trees, and the rain won't make the cherries crack, and it'll just solve all the problems. And so I think it was 2010 that I started building this greenhouse. The greenhouse went up in about a week. It's called a plywood rigid frame structure. It's used for enclosing large spaces like aircraft hangars, other big spaces. And you can see in the first slide here, the trees. I think in this slide, this is probably the second summer that the trees were in. And you can see they're small. There's an apple on the left starting to flower. I think that's a Williams Pride. You can see on the right, I have a plywood wall there for shear strength in the building.
I'm sorry to interrupt, Rob. There we go. I think we're back. Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay.
We lost the view of the picture again.
Okay. And so you can see how the trees are spaced out. Basically on the left side, which is the south side, I have a row of raspberries that runs across close to the greenhouse plastic, figuring I would go from short to tall, from south side to north side. Then I have a row of apple trees that are all dwarf. They're all M27 rootstock. Down the middle, I have plums and cherries at the end, and there's a couple of pear trees in there too. And then on the back wall, I espaliate apples and pears. So from the first slide, you can see this is the second year for these trees. And then if we go to the next slide, I think you're a little bit advanced there, Burl. Yeah, there. So this is about 10 years later, and these so-called dwarf trees have grown tremendously and just filled the space with greenery. And to the point where the trees on the back wall don't get as much sunlight as they should have, because these plums and pears and cherries in the middle have just grown so much that they're kind of shaded out. So I need to do some more severe pruning on these to get some light to the back of the greenhouse. You'll notice a couple of things here. Early on, we tried some raised beds to grow vegetables in amongst the trees. And the first few years we did great. We had tomatoes, we had peppers, we had early season greens. And then as the trees grew and leafed out, we found that our garden boxes in here got shaded out. So we really don't grow much on the ground there anymore in those raised beds. The other thing you'll notice is there's a thick layer of leaves on the floor of the greenhouse. And every fall I rake up birch leaves, alder leaves, willow leaves, whatever I can get. And this layer of leaves does several things. It insulates the roots of the trees in the winter because there's no snow in there to insulate. And it also holds moisture in. And as the leaves decompose, they help to feed the trees. So unlike in Rob Bishop's high tunnel, with his trees being in pots that have to be watered consistently, I rarely have to water in the greenhouse. The roots of these trees go down through the forest soil and hit the layer of clay that's underneath. The clay is like a big sponge, and the trees just soak up that moisture. Even in the driest summers, I can put my hand down under the leaves and it's moist under there. And there are lots of earthworms. So let's see, looks like you're on the third slide already. Yeah, don't go so fast, Burl. Let's go back a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a question from Ed. The greenhouse is, let's go back one more, Burl. Yep, okay. So the greenhouse is 24 feet wide and 48 feet long and is 16 feet high at the peak. And I'll talk about the construction later on in the slideshow. But yeah, you can see in this one, the trees are starting to flower. The one that's on the right now, the trees are about 4 to 5 years old at this point. They really like it in there. They've grown quickly. Okay, let's go to the next slide. This is, go to the next one, Burl. Yeah, you can see here, this is probably year 5 or 6, and I'm on the one with the cherry trees in bloom, if you go back one. Yeah, by year 3, I was starting to get sweet cherries, and year 4 and 5, I started getting apples. And, you know, as Rob Bishop said, the trees inside the greenhouse will start to flower weeks earlier than anything outside is flowering. And I can really tell how many bumblebees have survived the winter by the number of bumblebees on the sweet cherries and the plums that are blooming first. And these trees are so aromatic. You can see there's a chair in there on the lower left. My wife got me this for Father's Day one year. And going in this greenhouse on a sunny day in the spring when it might be 50 degrees outside, it's 75 in the greenhouse, and it's just really pleasant to sit in there. And the aroma of the blossoms is just overpowering. It's just wonderful to sit in there and listen to the bees and watch the bees pollinating the trees and smelling the aroma. The plum blossoms are especially aromatic. So it's really a great time of year. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Yeah, so there on the left, these are Akane apples on an M27, and right next to that I have the Williams Pride, also on M27. And if we go to the next slide, Burl. Yeah, I also grow pears, and I really like pears, and it's wonderful to be able to grow pears. I tried to grow pears outside, and even in the few years when I did get pears, they just weren't very sweet. Just wasn't warm enough to bring out the sugar in the fruit. But the pears that I've grown in the greenhouse have been really good. My favorite variety is a Seckel pear, which is also called a sugar pear. It's a small red pear, and they're just really good. I've done really well with sweet cherries. I have a Rainier and a Bing, the 2 common commercial varieties you can get in the supermarket. But these off the tree are like a completely different fruit than the supermarket variety. They're just so sweet and really good. By the time cherries show up in our supermarkets from California or from Washington State, the flavor has really been dulled quite a bit by refrigeration. And the cherries from the greenhouse are just amazing. And the birds don't get them, and it doesn't rain in the greenhouse, so they don't crack. Okay, let's go to the next one. Yeah, plums. I've got five different varieties of plums in the greenhouse. The Methley plums are really juicy and sweet. The ones in the photo there are called Blues Jam, and they're a European plum, so they're not as juicy as the Japanese plums like the Methley. And they're not quite as sweet, but we get hundreds and hundreds of plums off this tree every year. And mostly we dry them. We have a dehydrator that goes all through the fall. We dry many, many, many gallons of apples and dried plums. The next slide there, you can see a pot full of Rainier cherries. That represents about a day's picking. I pick them over a couple of weeks in the summer, and day after day we'll get that many cherries. In addition to raspberries. Those are Cascade Delight raspberries in that bowl. And when the raspberries are going, we pick about a number 10 cans worth a day. One summer we harvested over 50 gallons of raspberries from the greenhouse, made lots of jam. And as Rob Bishop said, the fruit is just perfect. Occasionally you get a little bit of insect damage from caterpillars, but by and large, it's just untouched. It's just beautiful fruit. Okay, let's go to the next one. Okay, here's the greenhouse in winter. I took these photos just a week or so ago. And as you can see, I constructed the greenhouse with 2 different roof pitches. I wanted to try to capture as much sun as possible. So I made my trusses a 6-12 pitch on the south side and a 12-12 pitch on the north side. The north side sheds the snow very well, but as you can see in the photo on the right, the south side holds the snow. And I have problems in a heavy snow year like we had last year or 2012, where I actually have to get up on this roof and shovel it, which is a big job. And the greenhouse fabric that I've used is an 11 mil polyethylene, a woven polyethylene that's UV resistant, lasts for many, many, many years. And I get it from Northern Greenhouse Sales, which is in North Dakota. And in 2012, when we had so much snow, I called up the guy, his name is Bob Davis, and I said, Bob, how much snow can I let build up on this fabric before it tears? And he said, it won't tear. Your building will collapse before the material tears. And he was right, because my rafters started to crack and break, and the fabric didn't tear. So I ended up putting posts under my long rafters to keep them from collapsing, and ended up shoveling the roof a lot. So if I were to build another greenhouse in the future, I would make both sides 12-12 or at least 10-12, just so the snow sheds off of there. What else? I mentioned this is called a plywood rigid frame structure. I first got the idea for this from a booklet I got from the American Plywood Association. And the idea behind it is that you build trusses. You have 2 studs, 2 rafters, and plywood gussets on the corners, on the haunches and at the peak. And it makes the truss really strong. And 2 of us built this greenhouse in about a week, and that included pouring a concrete foundation. So it goes up really fast. You just cut all your parts, and then you just nail everything together, make a big pile of trusses. And then once you have your foundation down, you just set the trusses up, and instantly you have a building. Goes together really quickly. Okay, let's go to the next one. Show you some of the interior details. Yep. Oh, we skipped one. Let's go back. Yeah, there's the foundation. I just dug into the dirt and poured some concrete. I have a little cement mixer, and I just get sand and gravel and bags of cement and some water. I made pads that were about 2 feet square, and then put sonotube on top of those, put rebar in there. And you can see there's a 6 by 6 wet anchor that's put into the top of the post. That holds a 6x6 sill beam, and then the trusses are just stood up on top of the sill beam. And the next photo, you can see that in each of the gable ends, there's a vent that's about 3 feet square. I have it covered with 1-inch chicken wire so birds can't fly in, but bumblebees can come in and out easily. And you can see the gussets at the peak. It's very strong when you nail these plywood pieces on both sides. It makes for a very strong structure. Okay, let's go to the next one, Burl. Okay, these are the haunch gussets on the left, just little triangular gussets. Lots of nails. You'll go through 50-pound boxes of nails easily if you build one like this. And you can see on the right that they're all the same, and they just, they're in a big pile when you construct them, and you just stand them up on your foundation. You do have to brace them though, otherwise they will fall over like dominoes. And you can see on the right wall, the north wall, there's a layer of 1/2-inch plywood that I've painted white to get some reflectivity back onto the trees. But without that plywood, the building would just fall over. Yeah, there's a view of the back wall. And it's important to have ventilation. You could see on both of the gable ends, there's about a 3-foot by 3-foot window with chicken wire, and the breeze just blows through all year round, and it keeps the moisture from building up. If you get too much moisture in your greenhouse, you really have problems. You get molds forming and mildews, and the fruit just is much more susceptible to disease. So you want to have good airflow. You still get plenty of heat in there on a warm day. If it's 70 degrees outside, I've got 90 or 95 in there. The trees think they're in Yakima, Washington. So they don't mind the heat, but it's good to have that airflow moving through there, especially in September, October, when we have long stretches of rainy weather. You just don't want the humidity to build up too high in there. You don't want condensation on the inside of the plastic. So I think that's about it for the slides. Burl graciously put a photo of a guitar in here. That happens to be Burl's guitar that I built for him. And yeah, so we do artwork and I make musical instruments here. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Yeah, I have a question. When did you build the greenhouse then, Rob?
I put the greenhouse up, I think it was the summer of 2011 that it went up. So this past summer was the 10th year that the trees were in.
Okay, cool, all right.
How long do you expect that visqueen to last?
Well, it's not visqueen. It's different. It's woven like a blue tarp, but it's much more durable. I first used it on a small greenhouse that's in our yard, and the roof of that greenhouse lasted for 18 years. And it only failed when a snow shovel was accidentally put through it while clearing snow off of it. So I expect it to last quite a while longer. When I designed the greenhouse, I actually ordered an extra sheet big enough for the roof. I was intending to put a sheet on the inside for insulation, but I quickly realized that I didn't need it because it was plenty warm in there with just one layer. So I've kept it aside, and if I need to replace the roof, I have a sheet in reserve. I have had a few tree branches go through it, and I've had to patch it a little bit. You can see in the right-hand photo, there's a little notch in the ridge, and that's from a tree that fell, and the top of the tree flipped up and broke the little ridge block that I had up at the peak and tore the plastic. So I have to get up there and repair that, and I'm going to repair some of the cracked rafters this summer too. Greenhouse needs a little work, but but the plastic has really held up very well. And Burl did some research the other day. I went on their website and saw that these days their 11 mil polyethylene, depending on how big a piece you buy, it goes from 58 cents a square foot down to 36 cents a square foot. But Burl said if you buy a bigger quantity, it goes down lower than that.
Yeah, but I think that's about right though, Rob. You'd get 30, for a 40-foot greenhouse, you'd get around 35 cents a square foot or something like that.
Yeah, which is much, much cheaper than, say, putting Polygal on there, which is a 2-layer hard plastic.
Excuse me, what is the source of that material again?
It's called Northern Greenhouse Sales. I think their website is northerngreenhouse.com.
Thank you.
Another way to look, it seems like there's a range between 10, 11, and 12 mil. And this is 11 mil, but 12 mil is available too.
Yeah, I think the 12 mil is different. The 12 mil, I think, is silver, and you don't want that. You want the clear plastic, which is 11. Any other questions?
I've got one. What does your dehydrator look like?
The dehydrator?
Yes.
It's just a little wooden box with 6 rows of frames with mosquito netting on it. And then there's a little heating element at the bottom, like you might find in a smoker. And it has a little rheostat on it, so you can adjust the heat. And we just cut the fruit and put it on the racks. And in a couple of days, you've got dried fruit.
Thank you.
And we dry everything from, we dry pie cherries, we dry sweet cherries, we dry plums, and we dry a lot of apples. We've got, I don't know, probably 15 or 16 gallons of dried apples in the pantry right now. Pauline Strong says, how do you store the dried fruit? We just store the dried fruit in glass jars in our pantry. You have to make sure it's dry enough so that it doesn't mold. But once it's dry, it keeps for a long time.
So Rob, I have a question. So you talked about not growing your fruit trees in tubs and totes, instead letting the root system hit to the clay and tap into the natural water system. So
right.
I'm curious about how often you water your trees.
I hardly ever have to water.
Or have to.
Yeah, it never occurred to me to put my trees in pots. I think that's a really interesting idea, but I just planted them right in the ground. And as long as I keep a good layer of leaves over them to mulch them, that seems to hold the water in the soil. And I very rarely have to water. I do have a hose in there to water the raspberries because they seem to require more water than the fruit trees. I see a question from Sue, how do I heat the greenhouse? The greenhouse is only heated by the sun. There's no other heat source in there. So right now, it's very cold outside. It's very cold in the greenhouse too. And that's good because the trees all need a dormancy period. They need a certain number of chilling hours to be able to produce fruit the next year. Starting in March, the sun will be on the greenhouse and it'll start to heat up. And then usually by April, I've got blossoms in there.
I want to, so what's up with other people, by the way, can ask questions that relate to Rob Bishop's program too. I think that's just great if you want to talk about either one and ask questions about either one.
I saw that Ed had a question about fertilizer. The only thing I put down in my greenhouse are the leaves that I rake up in the fall. And then occasionally I'll put some seaweed in there too. If you put down seaweed with the leaves are carbon, the seaweed has a lot of nitrogen, and so it makes a good compost. But I discovered that if if you put down too much seaweed, it gets slippery in there. So you have to be careful where you put it. I try to keep it off my pathways. Oh, the other thing that I didn't mention, and we didn't have a slide for it, is that I have some trees outside that are espaliate on the side of the house. And this is something that if you don't want to go through the expense and the trouble of building a greenhouse, you can train an apple or a pear tree to grow on the side of your building. And you get not as much of heat gain as you would in the greenhouse, but you get quite a bit of heat gain just reflected off a building. And so you can create a microclimate that's warmer for that tree than you would just 10 feet away. And so if you have a fence, south-facing fence, or a side of your house, you can ripen fruit better that way than you could out in the open.
Well, please go ahead. Go ahead.
How far apart are you spacing your trees?
The dwarf trees in the row on the south side of the greenhouse are about 4 to 5 feet apart. It's, those are M27. They're supposed to not grow any more than 6 to 8 feet high. They're more along the concept that Rob Bishop was showing, where the trees are planted closely together in a row. And since they're not very big, they do fine. The bigger trees in the middle, I have spaced about 10 feet apart. And the apples that are espaliate against the back wall are about 8 feet apart.
So looking at the structure of the different greenhouse, and Rob Bishop talked about, the Gothic structure, and of course it looks like different shapes and everything. And I know when you talked about like having different pitch, but that one, it looks like there was still a little snow buildup. So I guess the structure of the Gothic style, do you ever get snow on it? Or snow stuck on the roof?
Hey, bro, this is Rob Bishop.
Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, absolutely. No, the tendency with those systems are you'll get 3 to 4 inches and then they'll slowly shed. If you get a really heavy dump and it's really wet, you have to kind of keep an eye on it every once in a while, and especially if it doesn't have a place for the snow to drop, which is one of the reasons why the advantage of a high tunnel or a system like Rob Goldberg's is the snow has a place to drop versus a low greenhouse system down low where the snow just builds up and then creeps up and then it can't slide down the roof. So yes, it can be an issue. You got to monitor it, and sometimes you got to shake it from underneath to get it to come down.
I saw a question about the greenhouse fabric. This 11 mil woven polyethylene, you cannot see through it like it's a window. It's translucent. It lets in a lot of light, but you can't see through it.
There's also a question up there about salt buildup from Ed, and if you've had any problems with it indoors.
Yeah, I have not. The seaweed that I get from the beach tends to be out in the rain, and I think the salt just washes off.
My experience, I've layered up at one point in my beginning days, 8 inches or so. I mean, I've really layered it up, trying to see how far I can go with it. And I had concerns originally about the salts, but I think for the amount of watering we do at times, I would have thought in the beginning that I did think that it was going to be an issue, but I've never had an issue with it. It's not to say it couldn't be an issue, but every year we do it and it's never been an issue. The plants have always thrived, and I can't tell you why. I just believe that it just washes through over the season when we do it once or twice a year, meaning in the wintertime. So that's my summation at this point.
Question about Rob Bishop about the 30-gallon pots. Nancy Berlin has a question. Basically, how heavy are those pots, and are those pots that are the 30-gallon ones, are they moving?
So it's a good question. 30 gallons is what I got in the very beginning, and that's what you see on those Honeycrisp trees. Yes, they're heavy. I don't like moving them. In fact, the best situation I believe would be to make like a square pot you can put on wheels, but utilize a fabric no different than what the air pots are, which is pretty much ground cloth, but you want the fibrous-y water let it through version. And I've been contemplating in my own mind kind of my own design of pots, making them even out of yellow cedar, and put them on wheels, or make it easily moved with a dolly. And so that's the ideal situation. I'm kind of the school. I started out without anybody showing me how to do this. It's just something we used what we had at the time and what I've read online, and it just worked. But I believe there's a lot of room for improvement, and I would definitely recommend, if you don't know how to build a pot or do something similar to what I just said, the 30-gallon pots really it works. You could see it works. You could see a 8-10-year-old tree, and you can get a big, thick stem on it. And you just want to be able to have something that's stable, or wider. Otherwise, the tree will get fruit and it will fall over time. So a narrow pot is not what you really want. So, but again, the root system is dwarfing, being dwarfed by those air pots. If you do a little research online, you'll see that. So it's what I had. Yes, they are very heavy. I don't recommend having to move them too many times, but if you're going to do it, there's room for improvement.
A question for Rob Bishop. How cold do you normally get there in Hoonah in winter? I mean, I'm just curious because I've had problems I tried the first couple years to have a couple pots in my greenhouse with trees in them, and they all died. The roots were killed. So I'm just wondering what the temperature is there versus with up here in Haines.
Yeah, well, it rarely gets to zero, but we get down to, obviously we just had negative temperatures.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know what rootstock you're utilizing, but I don't know how else to answer that. It may be, Blythe, there might be some other issues there. Do you know what rootstock it is?
I don't remember what it was now. It was a while ago. It was a couple plums that I had in there. And so I'm wondering if it's a plum thing, because the apple that I had in there survived. It did fine. But the plums that I had in there both died. And it was the Zionwood actually flowered, and I thought it was good, and then it died because the rootstock itself was dead. So I'm not really sure. But yeah, I was just curious.
Yeah, and if you're dealing with plums, that's a whole different. You're gonna have to experiment with what root system works best for you, because we're pretty fortunate. We've got a root system that we utilize that somebody has had old trees here, and they've got suckers all over, and we're able to use those, and they're proven. But yeah, you're gonna have to experiment with that. Right?
Yeah, I kind of figured it was a plum thing. Like I said, the apple did fine, but it was the plums that I had didn't like me.
Rob Bishop, question about the Oregon crab and varieties that work, the varieties you mentioned. We didn't quite drill down into that, but what's working to graft onto the rootstock of the Oregon crab? Yeah,
so what I do know is if you do any research on the Oregon crabapple, there's been some studies on it. Oregon crabapple it grows in the muskeggs here all over the place. And I've tried mostly Williams Pride. I know a few people have done Williams Pride. And again, if you do your own research on it, it's very much an unknown rootstock as far as what is capable or compatible with it, because it is a harder wood on there. And so sometimes what will happen is you'll get to graft, but the sign wood will grow bigger than the root system, and just more of a vigorous sign wood, and it can create some issues later on, and you wouldn't know this until later on in the season. But it is one that is available here, and it is proven as far as what works outside. In fact, we've growing one right now on a muskeg. So we're trying to grow apples on a muskeg, and pretty much what I'm realizing is that root systems on a muskeg, they still have their own laws of what makes a tree grow, and it just suppresses the tree. I mean, it grows, but it hasn't produced much of anything. So there's a lot of room for experimentation on there, but I can't tell you everyone. I just know Williams Pride.
I see.
Someone had a question about what varieties will pollinate Williams Pride, and I think any of the early flowering apples will pollinate it just fine. There's a chart in the Rain Tree Nursery catalog, or probably on their website, that will show you the blooming order of the different varieties of apples. And as long as they're blooming at the same time, they will pollinate each other. I think there might be a few exceptions to that. Like, I don't think Gravenstein pollinates much of anything else, but almost all of them will pollinate each other. Any other questions?
Thanks, you guys. This has been really inspiring.
Good.
Yeah, excellent presentations. Thank you.
Yeah, there are some questions on the chat that you haven't addressed.
There's Rob or both, either Rob, do you use, or any reason to use the trunk or tree guards inside of the greenhouse?
This is Rob Goldberg. Yes, I've used the 1/4-inch hardware cloth. I have it on most of my trees. I haven't lost any trees either inside or outside to voles. I know they're around, and I have seen them in my traps, but they've never really gone after my trees.
Hey,
Let's
bro.
see. Yeah, go ahead.
Hey, I just a note on that. I mean, I've heard a lot of discussion in the past. Hardware cloth, and Rob Goldberg just said it, in my opinion, especially outside, works great because you want to get ventilation in a rainforest area like here. But I would say, though, for inside the greenhouse, I do not use it just because we've got so many trees. However, again, we've got the vole bucket on there. And I was going to say that another preventative on there to overcome these issues is when you prune in the wintertime, take some of those pruning cuts and just leave them on the ground. And that's a good way to kind of feed the critters and give you an indicator as to what's going on in your greenhouse, if you have a problem or not. And, you know, they're looking for an easy food source. And so now you're putting it on the ground in front of their face instead of them chewing on the side of your tree. And so it's just a good thing to be able to monitor. It makes a little bit of a mess during the year, but there's actually a purpose to that. That's it.
There's a question, Rob Bishop, that relates to, do you put the young tree in the 30-gallon pot from the get-go, or do you start with something smaller and then repot later?
Well, if you've got a pot that you're ready and happy with, I would just get it right in there. There's no reason to keep going up with it. But I do it sometimes just because we're shifting things all the time and experimenting. And I just don't have a big space right now. We're kind of getting a bigger greenhouse real soon.
All right. There's a question from Arnie in Teneke Springs. Do you have to leave the doors open besides the upper vents for bees for pollination, or do they stay in the greenhouse all winter? I'm not quite sure I've got that right.
Yeah, I can answer that. This is Rob Goldberg. I find that just having those 3-foot by 3-foot gable end vents is enough for the bees to come and go. I do have one roll up door, so to speak, on one end of the greenhouse where it's just a piece of the greenhouse plastic with a 2x2 stapled to it at the bottom. And I can roll that up and make a space that's about 8 feet by 8 feet to get more ventilation in there. The only time I have to do that is if we have a really hot day here where it's 80 or 85 degrees outside, I will open that door up just to let some cooler air in and let some of the heat out, because I have found that if it goes much over 105 or 110 degrees inside the greenhouse, the leaves will start to turn brown, especially the leaves up top close to the roof plastic. They just get too hot, and it almost looks like fire blight. They just have a burnt appearance. So I do open that up to try to keep the excessive heat down, but that's pretty rare.